Well, if this is your first time with us here at Hope Church Online, you picked a great time to watch because today we're starting our new series, Parenting in the 21st Century. And this is a series for anyone who has a child or a grandchild or planning on a future child or a niece or a nephew or influences anyone who's coming up in the next generation, because parenting is an incredible privilege and responsibility to raise up another human being. Now, before we jump in with today's content, I want to give you a quick public service announcement on what's coming up at Hope Church. On Sunday, March 7th, 4 weeks from today, we intend to go back to holding in-person services at Silver Lake Intermediate School. Now, for those of you who aren't ready or able to come back at this time, no problems. We're still going to be right here streaming all of our content online. You're not going to miss a thing. But for those of you who are ready to come back, we would love to have you in the room because the singing is way more fun when there's other people around. And if you're coming back, we want you to volunteer. When we have volunteers, we can give our guests an incredible experience and show them God's love in a practical way. So we would love for you to join a volunteer team or to rejoin a volunteer team, because that's how the Christian faith is expressed, by serving someone else. Not only does that give them a chance for their faith to grow, it helps your faith in God grow as well. Our faith is incomplete until it is expressed through humble service to someone else. So if you'd like to jump in and help out, send us an email to info@hopelakecountry.com or leave a note in the chat and we will follow up with you that way. Also, we're only going to be back in the school for a little while, because over the next 6 to 8 months, it's going to be a roller coaster ride here at Hope Church. We are working on our own facility, our own church to have for ourselves, and we'll be moving in late this summer. So if you want to stay in the know with everything going on at Hope Church, make sure you're subscribed to our Thursday newsletter, because we're coming up on one of those seasons where if you're not confused by what's going on at Hope, you're just not paying attention. A lot of amazing changes coming up going forward. Now, public service announcement over. Now I want to get back to talking about parenting. And the reason for this series right now is because parenting, raising another human being, has always been a challenge. It doesn't matter when a person lives, it doesn't matter where or what culture a person happens to live in. Parenting is always an incredible challenge, yet at the very same time, the modern world we live in has created some new and unique challenges to raising children that simply did not exist in previous centuries. For example, did you know that in the 17th century, some parents were concerned about the challenge of their child possibly becoming a bookworm? That's right. Initially, bookworm was a derogatory term used to describe a child who read or studied too much. That's not a 21st century problem for parenting. Our problems have more to do with too much screen time and how to regulate that and what's appropriate for each stage. And when does a child get a cell phone? And if you wait a little bit longer than some of your child's friends, they will swear to you up and down that they are the only kid in their entire school who doesn't have a cell phone yet. So when's the appropriate time to get a cell phone? And it used to be in previous generations that children would look to their parents or their grandparents, or maybe even the all-knowing Encyclopedia Britannica, if I can date myself, to gain knowledge and learn information. Now, children literally don't need parents to learn things or to gain things, or even teachers, because they have Google, they have YouTube. They can access all of the information of the world from the internet. Speaking of access, We've never lived in a generation where children have access to the entire world and, which is much more frightening, the entire world now has access to our children. And then to make all this even more complicated, last year when the pandemic hit, our kids started going to school at home, going to school from their bedrooms. So all of these challenges have created some unique circumstances for raising children in today's day and age. Now, it used to be that if a parent faced a challenge or a struggle and they said, hey, mom, hey, dad, hey, grandpa and grandma, do you have a tip? Do you have a hack? Do you have an approach to this particular challenge? It was pretty much good from generation to generation, but because these are challenges we've never faced before, we're figuring it out in real time and trying to find the path forward. And so that's why we're going to open up the pages of the scripture in this series to see what they have to say. The problem is, however, when it comes to tips and tricks on how to handle some of these unique 21st century challenges that parents face, the Bible, it's not very helpful. And the reason for that is because the Bible doesn't have any tips and tricks when it comes to raising children, because if it did, it would have written in a first century context and culture, and that would have become dated and obsolete so quickly. Instead, the biblical authors did something better. They documented some principles which have transcended all times and all cultures and all centuries and are still incredibly relevant to the world that we live in today. And in this series, we're going to unearth a few of those principles and see what they have to say to us about raising children in the 21st century. Now, before we jump into the content, one last thing you need to know today. This series was not my idea. In fact, this series was created by our friends at North Point Church. And I saw the series and I thought this is so relevant and helpful for where we are at today. I would like to use it. However, while I liked the bones of this series, I wanted to flesh it out in a unique way. And because they're always so gracious, they said, hey, do whatever you want, use what's helpful, you do your thing with the rest, because we don't live in your community, but you are there. So you take the series and make it whatever you want it to be. So in this series, we're doing something unique. We're doing something I've never done before in my communication. And here's what it is. It might be a great idea. It might be a terrible idea. I'll tell you in 4 weeks if it was or not. But what we're going to do is I'm going to be preaching most of the messages of the series, but every Sunday, we're going to cut away from me to Pastor Andy from North Point Church, who originally created the series, and we're going to hear about 12 minutes of what Andy had to say on that day's topic of raising children. Then I'll come back and I'll take it from there. And the reason for that is Andy has thought more about raising children than most pastors have, and he's further along the parenting path than I am, and he's got more experience than I do. So every week we'll turn away to him for a little bit, and then I'll come back and take it from there. So to get things kicked off and introduce the idea for the series, here's Andy. I'll see you in a few minutes.
When Sandra and I talk to parents about parenting, she always says something that gets everybody's attention. And for those of you who are in the season where you're raising middle school or high school students, you totally get this. Here's what she always says. She says, the days are long, but the years are short. And this is oh so true. I mean, on the front end, you feel like you have plenty of time, and then you blink and they're 10, and then they're graduating from middle school, and then they're gone. And you think, oh no, or you will think, oh no, are they really ready? Did I tell them everything they needed to know? Did I prepare them for life? And the answer to that question is always, no, you didn't. You probably forgot a few essentials, some really important things, which is understandable because you were busy. You were busy parenting. Now, like most first-time fathers and mothers, I will never, ever forget the terror, and that's the right word, the terror I felt when the nurse at the hospital, you'll remember this, some of you, closed our car door as she sent Sandra and me home with a baby by ourselves. What were they thinking? I knew what I was thinking. I was thinking, surely one of you is coming home with us. I mean, what if we do this wrong? And I think that's the first time that it dawned on me that just because I have a parent doesn't mean I know anything about being one. And maybe more to the point, just because I was a kid once doesn't mean I know anything about raising one. And so you'll remember this, some of you. So you're sitting in the car, the doors are closed, you don't know what you're doing. It's just terror. I think it's just terror. I mean, there's excitement, but there's terror. And the nurse, she just stood there and she waved goodbye with that knowing look on her face. But we figured it out. But we didn't figure it out on our own. Sandra and I were sponges, like many of you are. We were sponges for good parenting advice, whether it came from books or videos or friends or even experts. And honestly, we had an advantage that most people don't have. At the time, I was serving as the student pastor at our church, which meant I had the opportunity to oversee our middle school and high school students, which meant we had lots of interactions with parents of middle schoolers and high schoolers, that we had interaction with the parents. We saw great examples, and we saw what we considered some really bad examples. But when we saw parents who had a healthy relationship with their teenagers, we were not shy about inviting them to lunch. We wanted to know their game plan. We would say, we want your map. We want to know how you did it. How did you get them from the car seat to the driver's seat with the relationship intact? And the relationship was so important to us because, again, we'd seen so many parents undermine their relationship with their kids. And nobody does that on purpose. Nobody has a plan to undermine their relationship with their teenage or their adult kids, but we saw it over and over and over. And when we saw parents who got it right or who did it right, we wanted to know how they did it. And every time we would ask these parents for advice, they would just kind of look at each other and shrug, and they would say things like, "We don't know, we just loved our kids." But we knew better. They had a map. They had an approach, they had some habits, but it was so intuitive to them, they couldn't verbalize it. But Sandra and I were students, and we were serious about figuring this out, and to some extent, we were afraid, right? Because we wanted to get it right. And here's what we noticed. Here are a few things that we noticed up front. The parents who seemed to have been able to maintain a strong relationship even through the middle school and high school years, one of the things that was true of almost all of them is that they had fewer rules. They had far fewer rules than the parents whose kids were always in trouble for breaking their rules. One of the things that we noticed when we did middle school and high school ministry together was how many kids were always on restriction. They were always on restriction. They were being restricted from things. They were grounded all the time. And in our experience, these kids never really got any better. They were always the troublemakers, and they were always in trouble. But when we talked to parents who had been able to maintain strong relationships with their kids, even through the middle school and high school years, we discovered that virtually none of them ever even used restriction or grounding as a tool to discipline their kids. We will come back to that later. The other thing that we noticed about these extraordinary parents who seem to have gotten it right is, and this may sound strange, they were not afraid of their children. They were not afraid of their children. Now, if you don't have children, this may seem strange to you, but I'm telling you, it is easy for parents to become afraid of their children. And when you fear your children are, just by nature of the fact that you're afraid of them, or you fear their response to you, they are in charge of the relationship. They're in charge, in some cases, of the marriage. But these unique parents, they did not fear the rejection of their children, and that's oftentimes what parents fear. They fear the rejection of their kids. They weren't afraid to discipline their children. But, again, they didn't discipline their children in the traditional ways that parents often discipline their children. Again, we'll come back to that later. Here's the other thing. Then I don't know exactly how to say this, so give me a minute. These extraordinary parents discovered, I think is the best word, they actually spent time discovering, or they discovered, and then they facilitated their kids' interest, their kids' strengths and their kids' talents, rather than, and this is key, rather than forcing or insisting that their children embrace what was most interesting to, or what came naturally to, the parents. In other words, instead of the athletic dad, insisting that his son be an athlete or his daughter be an athlete, instead they stood back and they were students of their kids, and they figured out the directions, the natural flow of their children, and then they invested in the natural flow rather than trying to force them into something. And again, we've all seen parents do the opposite of that. And again, we've all seen where that leads. In fact, maybe that's your story growing up. Your mom had a special interest, and she wanted you as her daughter to embrace what was interesting to her, but you weren't interested in it. And again, what happened, there was a relational friction. Somehow, these wise parents, they avoided all of that. Another thing that we noticed about these parents is that they resisted the temptation to involve their kids in everything. Not only were they not afraid of their children, they didn't fear their children missing out. In other words, here's how I say this. They prioritize relationship over experience. They prioritize their relationship with their kids and their kids' relationships with each other over experience. They prioritize the experiences that they could experience together over the experiences that sent everybody in 100 different directions. And then there was one other thing, and it's what I want us to spend the rest of our time discussing today. As we got to know these families through the years, through multiple years, we noticed that all of them had what we would consider healthy marriages. Not perfect, because there is no perfect marriage, but healthy. In fact, we walked away from those multiple conversations convinced that perhaps the best parenting tool of all, perhaps the best gift we could give our children, was a healthy marriage. And for some of you, that's when you put down your pen and that's when you stop taking notes. I understand that, because if a healthy marriage is part of the parenting equation, if it's an important part of the parenting equation, that's bad news for you, discouraging news for you, because it's out of reach for you. In fact, it's so discouraging, and I've been doing this for so long, it's so discouraging that honestly, I was tempted to skip this part of the series. As you can imagine, it would be easier to just leave marriage out of a conversation about parenting. And you know this, for years, there's been a push to do just that, to divorce parenting from marriage. And honestly, the parenting conversation is certainly easier, it's more comfortable, it's more politically correct if we just set aside the notion of the nuclear family, a phrase that we don't use that much anymore. The nuclear family is simply a father and a mother and children all living together under one roof. It's easier to isolate parenting to a standalone topic. But to do that, and here's what we're going to talk about for the next few minutes, to isolate parenting from marriage is actually to steal something valuable from the current and the next generation. To isolate parenting from marriage is to steal something valuable from your children and your grandchildren. To do so is to remove, well, it's not only to remove the bullseye, it's like removing the entire target. And hopefully that will become clear in the next few minutes. Now, that brings us to this uncomfortable tension that you're already beginning to feel, this uncomfortable tension between what's real and what's ideal. What's real and what's ideal. It's an uncomfortable tension because for many of us, ideal, when we talk about family and marriage, ideal is seemingly out of reach. And it would be more comfortable, again, to just put it out of sight. But part of my responsibility from time to time is to step into the emotional, uncomfortable, perhaps dangerous role of a prophet, to plant my feet and my heart and honestly my compassion in the middle of what's real while pointing to an ideal. And to ignore reality, and again, it's easy to do this when we talk about something like marriage, but to ignore reality leaves me speaking or teaching in such a way that doesn't take into consideration the families and the family dynamics that actual people are actually navigating. It leaves the impression, if we don't deal with what's real, it leaves the impression that the message of Jesus, and this is so important, to not delve into what's real, what's actual, is to leave the impression that the message of Jesus has no real bearing on real life. To ignore current reality, your current reality, leaves us with a static, kind of stained glass religion, removed from reality. Church and sermons become nothing more than reminders of somebody else's reality, standards that we will never attain to, a world that no longer exists if it ever existed in the first place. So, for a discussion on parenting to be relevant, we have to take into account what's real. which, again, should be really easy for Christians. And this may come as a shock. In fact, this may be offensive. But of all the people in the world, when it comes to embracing what's really going on with families and marriages, this should be second nature to us as Christians, because there are virtually no, as in none, there are virtually no good examples of family in the entire Bible. When it comes to illustrations of real-world family dysfunction, the Bible is actually your go-to source. I mean, just think about it. Think about the first family. You remember them? They were pretty much a disaster. Think about it. Sin entered the world. If you're a Christian, this is what we believe, that all sin entered the world through the first married couple before they even had kids. And then they immediately started blaming each other. And their kids, well, we don't know much about their kids, but what we do know is this, that one of their sons murdered his brother, and we're off to the races, the human races. Just about every Old Testament story involving family is bad. In fact, just about every Old Testament story that deals with family is horrible by modern standards. So the point being this, the church, we should be really good at taking into account the realities of family life, taking into consideration what's actually going on, taking into consideration what's actually going on in any conversation about parenting, because our book, our text, the Bible, is full of bad examples. But at the same time, and this is what makes this conversation so fascinating and actually so helpful. At the same time, the authors of the New Testament paint a picture of what could be and what should be, as it relates to family. They actually point us toward the ideal. While they clearly embrace reality, they also point us to this ideal. And we shouldn't be surprised, because they knew, and God knew, what we intuitively know, and that's simply this, that if we remove ideal from the equation, if we remove ideal from the family equation simply because it's out of reach for some of us in this generation, that simply ensures that it will remain out of reach for many in the next generation. Part of our responsibility as parents and grandparents, is to give our kids and our grandkids something to aim for, something to live for. Most importantly, something to decide towards.
So here's the tension that we are going to wade into with this series. When it comes to raising children, when it comes to investing in the next generation, will we fearlessly uphold what is ideal for families? Will we fearlessly uphold and cling to and pursue what is ideal for families, even if it is not possible for us to achieve that in our own reality with our own families? See, here's a driving force in culture today. The driving force is to normalize dysfunction. It's to normalize brokenness. And that makes sense, because when we mess up as parents, when we mess up when it comes to family, we feel bad about ourselves. We feel guilty. We know we messed up, and there's collateral damage. It's not just we ourselves who get hurt when we mess up in family. There are other people we care about who get hurt. And so what culture does is it tries to normalize dysfunction. It tries to rationalize and minimize the damage we've done. But for those of us who are followers of Jesus, He doesn't allow us to do that. In fact, what we see over and over throughout the ministry of Jesus is that on the one hand, He refuses to compromise God's ideal standards for our lives, but at the same time, He refuses to condemn people who fall short of that, who turn to Him in faith. I want to look at an example that we see of how Jesus did this when it comes to holding up this tension between what God's ideal is and what's real in our own lives. And we're going to look at Matthew chapter 19 to do that. In Matthew chapter 19, some of the Pharisees came up to Jesus. These are people who were religious, they were spiritual, they were kind of similar to clergy, they taught the Bible, and they always questioned Jesus because they didn't think that He acted like someone who came from God, because He didn't fit into their box, their clean little boxes of what a Savior would look like. So here's what happened in Matthew chapter 19. Some Pharisees came to Him to test Him. They asked, Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? Now, when they ask, is it lawful, they don't mean, is it legally available for us to do this? They meant in God's economy, in God's system of justice, in God's approach to this is good and this is bad and this is right and this is wrong and this is sin and this is okay. Is it okay with God for a man to divorce his wife for any and every reason? And the reason why they asked that is because in their day and age, they had a version of no-fault divorce that's wild by our standards. And here is how it went. A husband could say to his wife, for any and every reason, I divorce you. And it was over just like that. No lawyers, no courts, nothing. She is out of the house. Now, if she wanted to divorce him, too bad, she didn't have any legal rights. So that was accepted practice in their culture. So the Pharisees come to him and they say, is it lawful according to God's standard of right and wrong for a man, for a husband to do that? Here is Jesus' response, Matthew 19, verse 4. Haven't you read? Now he's talking about the Bible. He's talking about the Hebrew Scriptures. He's talking about what Moses, who wrote the first 5 books of the Bible, wrote on the topic. Now, of course, they have read this. They literally memorized this, but he answers their question by taking them back to what God had already said on the topic. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, before sin crept in, before we normalized dysfunction, before we felt bad about ourselves for falling short, so we started blurring the standard between good and bad, and we started compromising God's ideal. Haven't you read, he replied, that at the beginning, when everything was just the way God wanted it, the Creator made them male and female and said, for this reason a man will leave his father and mother and be united to his wife, and the two will become one flesh. So, they are no longer two, but one. Therefore, what God has joined together, let man not separate. Let no one separate. Not you, not a husband, not a wife, not anyone at all. Let no one separate what God has joined together as one. He says, guys, haven't you read the Hebrew Scriptures? This is God's ideal. This is His standard. Now, much like many of us, they didn't like that answer because that makes us squirm. That makes us a little uncomfortable. So here's their response. Why then, they asked, did Moses command that a man give his wife a certificate of divorce and send her away? So they said, okay, if that's the standard, why did Moses say it was okay for a man to divorce his wife? Why did he command husbands to give their wives certificates of divorce in order to dissolve the marriage? Jesus replied, Moses permitted you. He didn't command you. Moses permitted you. Moses made an exception. Moses made an allowance. Moses permitted you to divorce your wives because your hearts were hard. But it was not this way from the beginning. See, Moses made an allowance for it because your hearts were so hard against God that God wanted to make sure there was a way where women and children were protected. And so because God saw the damage you were doing, because you so compromised God's ideal and you lost sight, you lost focus of what God's ideal standard was, you compromised it. Moses said, I have to build in a mechanism to make society function. So Moses allowed it, but it wasn't that way from the beginning. That's a compromise of what God's ideal standard is. To which people in the audience could have said, but Jesus, what are we supposed to do with that? A lot of people in the audience are already divorced. Jesus, what are you going to do about all the divorced people? Well, that's easy. I'm going to give my life for them so that I can forgive every one of their sins. So it's okay to get divorced? No, that's not God's ideal. God's ideal is that let no one separate. So what are you going to do about all these divorced people? Jesus, I'm going to lay down my life to forgive them. Why? Because I love them. But they fell short of the ideal. I know. That's why I'm here. I'm here to save people who have fallen short of God's ideal standard. I'm here to forgive the sins of people who have fallen short because I love them. And this is a unique tension that Jesus not only invites his followers into, he says this is the place where we are to live. Because Jesus came from the Father, John chapter 1 tells us, full of grace and truth. He never, ever compromised God's ideals. He never, ever dumbed down the truth to make it more palatable to us. He never dumbed down God's holiness or God's standard. And do you know why? It's because he loves us. He's not about to compromise what God established as good for us so that we can be people who flourish. And because he loves us, he never compromised truth. But at the very same time, because he loves us, he never backed away from grace and mercy and forgiveness. So what we see in the life of Jesus is that Jesus always took the standard higher. He took the standard higher than where they thought it was. He took the standard higher than where culture had placed it. He took the standard higher than where the church people had placed it. Jesus always took the standard higher, and at the very same time, he took the grace deeper. He took the standard higher because he loves us. He took his grace deeper because he loves us. And that's what gives us courage. The grace of Jesus. That's what gives us courage in our lives today when we mess up when it comes to family, when we mess up when it comes to raising the next generation. It's God's grace that says, hey, I am here for you. I laid down my life for you. I am in your corner. And because I love you, I want you to get back up and pursue what is ideal, to uphold what is ideal. Even if it's not possible for you to achieve it, I want you to take a step closer to that, and I want you to uphold that standard for the next generation. So if you go out today and you try and take a step towards ideal and you fail, Jesus will come alongside of you and dust you off and say, that's okay. I love you. I forgive you. Tomorrow's a new day. Let's take a step tomorrow. And tomorrow, if you go out and you fail, Jesus will come alongside of you and he says, hey, I've got you. I love you. Let's go out and take another step tomorrow. And if the next day you go mess up again, Jesus is done with you. No, I'm kidding. He'll come alongside of you and say, hey, you are my child. I knew this would happen and I gave my life for you anyway. Don't condemn yourself. I'm not condemning you. I'm forgiving you, but don't compromise what is ideal when it comes to family and when it comes to raising children. So here's the question. When it comes to raising the next generation, are you going to embrace God's standard of ideal? Or will you let your own feelings of guilt, your own feelings of inadequacy, your own feelings of shame cause you to shrink back because of your failure? Or will you let God's grace fill in those low spots in our lives and move forward as a beloved son or daughter of God and fearlessly uphold what God's ideal standard is? And here's why I ask that question. Many of us, because I've heard so many stories, many of us were raised in homes where our parents were not brave enough to embrace this tension. Many of us were raised in homes where our parents, because they fell short of the ideal, they compromised and they refused to uphold what ideal is when it comes to family because of their own feelings of embarrassment or shame or guilt. And you got started out in life and you got started out in family and no one had ever held up God's standard as the ideal. And that made starting a family harder on you than it should have been because you didn't even know what ideal was. And now you've been coming to church. Now you've become a Christian. Now you've been reading the Bible. And I have people say this to me all the time, Jason, I wish someone had told me this 10 years ago. I wish someone had told me this 20 years ago. What if we were the generation that decided, yes, that's that's true. I wish I knew this a long time ago, but my children will never utter those words because even though I might have fallen short, even though it might not be attainable for me, I'm not going to compromise. What God's ideal is when it comes to what family looks like today. And even if I have not modeled it for them, I will teach it to them so that they have a higher target to shoot at than I had. See, as hard as what the biblical authors teach about family, and as much as that can trigger inadequate feelings inside of us, I've never met a divorced person who wanted their child to grow up and get divorced. I've never met someone who shared custody who wanted their children to grow up and have shared custody of their grandchildren. We want something better for our kids. We want something better for our grandchildren. So are you going to be willing to trust the grace of Jesus to the level where you can uphold a standard and pursue a standard that you have failed to achieve so that the next generation can hit a higher level with family, perhaps than we did? So here's today's big idea. When it comes to parenting, Jesus has an ideal, and he's not willing to compromise it. And Jesus forgives you when you fall short of it. He's not mad. He has grace. So if that's true, fearlessly pursue what is ideal. Because good parents hold firmly to God's standard of ideal, even while they're navigating through what it is that's real. So as we go forward in this series, we're going to hit some critical principles that help us navigate through parenting in the 21st century. And some of them you're going to go home and say, this is great, and you're going to implement it right away. But there might be some others where you have that cringe moment where you realize suddenly, ooh, I blew this one. Let God's grace cover you and jump in and uphold the ideal. God's cheering for you. I'm cheering for you. The next generation needs you. So let's pray. Father, I pray for everyone listening who has the responsibility in any sense of raising and developing another human being. I ask that we will be a people who are fearless because of your grace, who are fearless because of your mercy, who are confident that we are your beloved and redeemed children, and your blood covers all of our sins, our inadequacies, and our failures, so that we would be confident to teach our children and our grandchildren what your ideal standard looks like when it comes to parenting and when it comes to family. We ask that we will have this courage for their good. We pray it in your name, Jesus. Amen.